Well, it's my pleasure now to introduce our distinguished speaker, Professor Clancy Martin. We are very fortunate to have him here to give us a talk on the work he has done most of his life. So just a few words about his accomplishments and background. Clancy Martin received his PhD in philosophy from the University of Texas at Austin in 2003, and immediately after that he joined the faculty in the Department of Philosophy at UMKC, where he teaches the 19th century philosophy, existentialism, bioethics, philosophy of mind, logic, and philosophy of literature, and maybe some other courses. He also serves as a professor at the Ashoka University in India, where he teaches and mentors research projects in the Department of Philosophy. And we were chatting about his experience there. It's very enriching from what he told us. His research and his scholarly accomplishments are numerous and cover the ethics of social and behavioral sciences, health, behavioral health, especially in the area of suicide prevention, addiction treatment, and use of storytelling. That's a very unusual angle to the whole thing. The use of storytelling as part of the therapeutic processes. So he has blended the storytelling as a form of treatment for these kind of maladies. His writing has appeared in the New Yorkers, New York Times, Wall Street Journal, Ethics, Journal of the History of Philosophy, Harper's and Vice magazines. In fact, you cannot miss any of the top-notch journals and popular magazines where he has not contributed articles. His work has been an option for movies and television. Maybe he will tell us a little more about that. I don't know much about it. And has been translated into more than 30 languages. So that tells you about the popularity and the importance of the work he has been doing. So without much ado, I would like to welcome Dr. Martin Clancy to the podium and share his thought with us.
Okay, that sounds good. All right. Thank you all so much for having me, and especially at your end of the year meeting. I feel very lucky and honored to be here, and also to find myself among some faces I know and friends who have been mentors to me, like Louis. Since arriving at UMKC, he has always been such a kind and generous guide of my career when he was still at the university, and embodied a kind of grand intellectual vision that one hopes for as a young professor to encounter people like this. So I always felt so lucky to know Louis and to feel like I had his support as I was developing my career. There were times, as a philosopher trained as a philosophy professor, you sometimes, in all of the academic disciplines, I suppose, we silo a little bit, and I was always resistant of silos in the sort of research and writing that I wanted to do, and sometimes met resistance in the university a little bit, or even in my own department, and more than once Louis reassured me that no, you keep forging original paths, and that is the best way to develop your career, and this was very helpful to me, so thank you, Louis, for that. Now, today I'm going to talk to you just a little bit about something I've been working on recently, which is this grand philosophical question of suicide. You might remember that Albert Camus famously said that the only serious philosophical problem is the problem of suicide. And if you read a little bit in the great philosophers, you will find that there is really no great philosopher among them who hasn't seriously confronted this question. Not always in their own personal lives. That was among the ancient Greek and Roman philosophers. They very often took this question quite personally, actually. And a philosopher I'll be mentioning briefly today, Seneca, who was one of the most famous thinkers on suicide, died, of course, by suicide. Sort of a funny story, the death by suicide of Seneca, actually, because he was friends with Nero, and then Nero decided he didn't like him anymore, and so they come to him and put him under house arrest, and they said, well, you can commit suicide or you can go to trial. And Seneca knew the treatment he was likely to receive at the hands of his former mentor and benefactor, the Emperor Nero, so he quite reasonably opted for suicide. But then the arsenic that he kept at home to help him with the suicide didn't work. So he tried slashing his wrists, that didn't work. Then he tried, I can't remember what he tried next, and finally he had his servants taken to a hot bath where, according to the tradition, he was overwhelmed by the steam and finally died. Well, any of you have taken a hot bath, you know that it's a little improbable that you're going to be overwhelmed and killed by the steam. So presumably he had his servants either drown him or throttle him in some way. But anyway, he did finally die by suicide. His wife also attempted suicide at the same time, but actually, like most people who attempt suicide, and I'll be talking about this briefly, didn't die, but survived and went on to lead a perfectly happy life, and Nero mercifully left her alone. Anyway, how did I get onto this suicide business? Before I tell that quick story, I wanted to tell everyone here that, just a few, I don't want to overwhelm you with statistics, but like a few quick statistics just are probably helpful. Suicide is always among the top 10 leading causes of death worldwide, always. And usually outranks the ones that you kind of think of, it certainly always outranks cancer, outranks heart disease, these kinds of things, when we look to the World Health Organization to ask what can be done about this worldwide epidemic, always in the top 10 causes of death, they say the single simple thing that can be done to counteract this, what is effectively a worldwide pandemic, is overcoming stigma. That's it. Overcoming stigma. How do you overcome stigma? It's not complicated. We all know how it's done in ordinary life, right? All you have to do is talk about it. And there's two interesting things. You may have noticed the change in the news lately, actually, that for a long time when famous people died in this country or elsewhere, if they died by suicide, they wouldn't tell you the cause of death. And the reason for that is there's a thing called, it's called the Werther effect, or Werther effect, after Goethe's novel, The Sorrows of the Young Werther. And when Goethe's novel, The Sorrows of Young Werther, was published, which concludes with a suicide, it was immediately a phenomenon, and a whole bunch of young men around, particularly Middle Europe, but throughout Europe, copied this novel, the suicide told in this novel, and took their own lives in the same method that Werther took his own life. And it is true. So for example, when Robin Williams died by suicide, and word was spread that Robin Williams had taken his own life, the suicide rate went up, and it's about 7,000 people died of suicide, above what would otherwise have been the number that we would have expected. So no, non-trivial number. There's another effect called the Papageno effect, after Mozart's opera, The Magic Flute. You might remember the character of Papageno, who's despondent, depressed, he's planning on killing himself. And then his friends get together and talk to him about what's going on with him, and he changes his mind. Well, what we know now, and this is relatively recently discovered, in the past 30 years or so, the literature on this emerged, is that if we have conversations about suicide, just as the World Health Organization advises us, the suicide rate that are informed, that are intelligent conversations, basically, like enriching conversations, whether it's something that you publish, or you're talking with friends and family, or you're doing a public talk like this, the suicide rate in the population exposed to the conversation goes down. Their likelihood of suffering from what we call suicidal ideation or chronic suicidal ideation goes down among that population. And this is kind of the remarkable part, all of the people that they know, all of the people they regularly interact with, their rate of suicide and, bizarrely, of suicidal ideation also goes down. It's a very well documented effect. So it's surfacing now, and you'll see if you've been paying attention in the past. It's a brand new movement, movement of which I am a part. But in the past 5 years or so, people are starting to recognize that stigma is a big part of our problem on this particular topic, and that if we just have informed, intelligent conversations talking about suicide in a real way, whether it's in the New York Times or wherever it happens to be, we actually will wind up helping people rather than harming people. We'll start to move past this problem of stigma. And this is very much has informed and continues to inform my own work. Now, one more quick statistic, just because, or maybe two more quick statistics. It used to be that the always number one or number two cause of death for people ages 15 to 24 was suicide. And right now it's still the number two cause of death. But in a particularly alarming development, that age range seems to be expanding. And now, in our most recent statistics, for the population between age 10 and age 25, the number two cause of death worldwide is suicide. It's a statistic that would probably surprise most of you, I think. And we're going to talk about how you can help with that. Because there's no one who can help probably more with that statistic than the people in this room. The other statistic I wanted you to be aware of is that starting at about age 55, your chances for death by suicide skyrocket. I mean, they go way up. And for women, I'm happy to tell all of you, around 65 or so, there's just like this 10-year real danger window for women. 54 to 65 is the most dangerous, and then after 65 it starts to drop off again. For men, particularly men in America, it only continues to escalate. And the highest, the people most likely, this is a bizarre statistic, but the people most likely to die by suicide in this country are white men aged 85 or older. Yeah, so men, your risk of suicide only gets worse every year that you age. And there's actually a quick story I want to tell you about a fellow who reached out to me about 3 months ago. I'll call him Rick. Rick isn't his name. He lives in Georgia, I can say that much. Rick is in his early 70s, and he happened to come across, he was Googling the best ways to kill yourself online, and this is usually how people find me. Googling best way to kill yourself, and then soon it'll be AI, soon they'll be asking ChatGPT, or if they're not already asking ChatGPT, what are the best ways to kill myself? But anyway, and then one of my articles came up, and mercifully, I'm very easy to find through Google. If you Google Clancy Martin, UMKC comes up very quickly, and people email me, and hundreds of people email me every year, maybe thousands of people who are in similar situation with Rick. Rick is a gun owner and isn't married, has some children, but his children don't talk to him anymore. And so he reached out to me and he said, Clancy, give me any reason to live. I've got a gun, I can do this painlessly, why should I stay alive? And also, he recently lost his job as an engineer. I don't know exactly why, I haven't asked him that yet. We text every day now, along with lots of other people in similar circumstances. And he's door dashing to pay his bills, but his house is more expensive than he still owes on his mortgage, and it's more expensive than he can afford to pay by door dashing. And so he actually just declared bankruptcy, which he managed to buy himself some kind of window of 90 days. And he's like, okay, but Clancy, but when this 90-day window comes out and they force me out of my house, that's it. I'm not doing that. I'm just gonna end it with my rifle then. And I remember at one point he said to me, I just want someone to give me the permission to do this. I just want someone to tell me that, hey, it's Rick, it's okay for you to do this, because the friends he do have, surprise, surprise, Rick, come on, buddy. When he tells them, and I'm grateful to say that he will reach out to his friends, that he wants to take his own life. They all, of course, try to talk him out of it, which I'm doing too, but I have a more elliptical path than some paths, which what we're talking about today. But the reason I wanted to bring Rick up is he's a classic example of someone who dies by suicide in this country right now. He's a white male gun owner of advanced years who feels cut off from his family, and when we look at deaths, the most likely deaths by suicide in this country, those are the people that we see. Now, the people who kind of go unseen are where I actually spend most of my time. And those are people who suffer from what we call suicidal ideation or chronic suicidal ideation, which is just like when you have the thought popping into your head over and over again, like, wouldn't it be a good idea to kill myself? And so now I was going to tell you how I got into this work. It was about maybe 10 years ago now, and an editor for a magazine I'd never heard of called Epic magazine, was founded by the guy who made the movie, I just forgot the name of the movie about a Canadian rescuing a bunch of people during the Iran hostage crisis. He founded this magazine, Epic. This editor reached out to me and he said, hey, could you write some kind of piece of we're fans of your work, could you write a piece of long-form journalism for us? And I said, I don't really do long-form journalism, and I definitely don't know how to do investigative journalism. I'm a philosophy professor. And he said, well, maybe you could do you've written a lot of memoir, maybe you could do some kind of piece of memoir. And so I said, well, I do feel like we have not a very good recent treatment of how people actually, the kind of care people get in psychiatric hospitals, which I had spent some time I've spent some time in psychiatric hospitals here in Kansas City also. well, around the country. Anyway, so I was thinking, you know, kind of like just the name of that famous book has just flown out of my mind. One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, yes. Sort of like a contemporary One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest. And he said, oh yeah, that sounds great. And so we started working back and forth on this long piece of memoir. And then he stopped me at a certain point and he said, Clancy, I want to ask you a question. And I said, yeah. And this is after we'd been working together for a few months on this piece. He said, it seems to me that every time you've gone into the psychiatric hospital, you've gone in for the same reason. And I said, yeah, that's true, Ed. I thought about it, and I was like, yeah, every single time I've gone to the psychiatric hospital, it's because of a failed suicide attempt. I've attempted suicide more than 10 times. Which you might, you know, they say you should start off these talks with a joke, and I always kind of feel like there's no joke I can tell is funny as the fact that I've attempted suicide more than 10 times, and yet I sit before you here today. Like, how incompetent can this guy possibly be? He can't be that hard, Clancy. Come on. Get with the program. All we gotta do is go to the gun shop. Yeah, I used to have a gun. And if you suffer from suicidal ideation, I want to tell you, please, if you don't have a gun safe, at a minimum get a gun safe. And ideally, if you can, get that gun out of the house. And if you have anyone in your family who you think might be struggling in this way, the first thing to do is trying to eliminate the most obvious forms of lethal means. And there's nothing more effective, I'm sorry to say, than a gun, which is why we have such incredibly high rates of this sort of death among the military, former military, and of course any other security sort of police, that sort of thing. Anyway, I said, yeah, you're right. It's because I've attempted that. Every time I've been in the psychiatric hospital, it's because I've a failed suicide attempt. And he said, well, would you mind shifting the focus of your essay onto suicide rather than psychiatric hospitals? Because his daughter, it turned out, had just made an attempt while we were working on this essay together and failed and wound up in a hospital. And so he was trying to understand where she was coming from. And I said, no, yeah, of course. And so then we published this essay, and then the essay, suddenly it was picked up. All of the Huffington Post picked it up, and then the New York Times picked it up, and then suddenly it was everywhere. And then suddenly a lot of people started reaching out to me about their struggle with suicidal ideation and or failed suicide attempts. And then I thought, okay, well, and then people started not killing themselves after I had, interacted with them. And as a philosopher, you don't expect that kind of thing. As a philosopher, you spend a lot of time saying why people ought or ought not do this or that, or analyzing their reasons for ought or ought not doing this or that, or whatever, but you never actually expect someone to sort of reach out to you, say, I'm thinking of another person right now, a vet, who right now he's so gratifying. He sent me pictures of his graduate. He just got his master's degree in musicology, and now he's going on to get his PhD in musicology at University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill. But when he first reached out to me, when I opened my email one morning, he's like, I know you're not going to get this, and when you do, I'll be dead, because I'm writing this with one hand, and with my other hand, I've got my rifle in my mouth. And he's like a buddy of mine now. We text once a week or so. Just like simple, how you doing? And then, he'll send me back somewhere between a 3, and then I think the highest I've ever gotten from him is about an 8.5. And I'll text him back, how I'm doing. And, I'm happy to send a 1 or a 10. But anyway, so that's how I got into this work. I realized, oh gosh, there are all these other people out there who are like I am. Have now a word or two about me. My earliest memory, and we know these like memories of memories of memories of these replicated memories, but the best we can work with, is that like the color of the carpet in my dad's study and the thought, oh, I want to die. And my first suicide attempt was when I was only 6. And I've since met people who have made suicide attempts as young as age 3. It's not something to think of. We used to think that children couldn't even conceive of death before age 5. Now we know that that's a mistake. I always think that it was all these old mistakes in psychology and psychiatry come from the fact that it's only recently that we've got women into psychology and psychiatry. They actually used to think that babies couldn't feel pain. I mean, that was like a standard view for a couple centuries of medical practice in the West, that babies couldn't feel pain. Anyway, happily we've moved past that. And then when I was a teenager, I thought that everybody felt this way. And when I talked to, I mean, for me, it was just like, it's like, if you presently have or well remember that undertone of, I want to have sex. I want to have sex, I want to have sex, I want to have sex. That's how it was for me with wanting to die. It was just like this constant undertone all day long. I want to kill myself, I want to kill myself, I want to kill myself. And I thought everybody felt the exact same way. When I started to talk to my friends when I was a teenager about this, I had a couple attempts when I was a teenager, and they would say no, or I remember one friend of mine who's a psychiatrist now, Tim Collar, was like, yeah, I feel that way a lot, but not all the time. I thought they were just lying to me. And it wasn't until, really I was in my 20s when I started and had some serious romantic relationships where you have those kinds of, really intense talks, that I realized, no, that, not everybody feels this way. Lots and lots of people don't. And then I started to worry, happily my older brother also felt this way, and he was very frank with me about it. And he made a suicide attempt and happily failed, and like a moron, didn't reach out to me just about 3 years. It's kind of a funny story actually, because my older brother, when he made his attempt a few years ago, he took like 200 Xanax, and we're getting the calls, oh yeah, Darren attempted suicide, and my little brother called me and he said, well, one thing's obvious, he didn't read your book. And I said, what do you mean? He's like, well, in the very first page of the book, you attempt suicide by taking too many Xanax, and you comment about how it doesn't work if you do Xanax. It's like, yeah, well, I laughed, and it's like, but I couldn't help but worry that, somehow or other, reading my book had galvanized my big brother into action. But you should know, that's a myth. Even though I was afraid to it myself, we worry about planting a seed, and there is no such thing as planting a seed. It's only opening a conversation. Anyone who is actually, and this is what I tell people who've lost loved ones, friends and loved ones to suicide, I tell them this all the time, it is the vast majority of people who actually die by suicide, first of all, have made a previous attempt, and second of all, have struggled with suicidal ideation all of their lives. The vast majority of them, and we know this now. We used to talk about suicide as like a spontaneous act. There's a friend of mine named Tom Joyner, who's a professor at Florida State University, and Tom says that there is no such thing as a spontaneous suicide, that it never happens. I think that might be like a slight exaggeration, but, and Tom is a survivor too, an amazing scholar. But, as a rule, it's true that, even when we go to look at the lives of Anthony Bourdain, you might remember, died by suicide. Anthony Bourdain, although he died from his first attempt, which turns out to be a little bit unusual, struggled with depression, anxiety, and suicidal ideation all of his life, for as long as we can keep track of his mental life. He's reporting this to friends, family, and also in his journals. Okay, now we should get to, how am I doing for time?
Can I ask a question?
Please.
Just based on your presentation so far, it would seem to me there has to be a genetic component to suicidal ideation. Is there a genetic component to it? Is there a certain part of the brain in these individuals that actually makes them think of killing themselves? Any particular part of the brain, at least as long as we know parts of the brain, I would just ask you.
Yeah. So I think the question was about a genetic component.
Yes.
Is that right? Yes, exactly. Well, there's a lot of really interesting, really new literature on this subject. And probably the best thinker on the genetic aspects of particularly suicidal ideation is a person at Johns Hopkins University named Kay Redfield Jameson. And Kay argues that we will one day find the genes specifically associated with suicidal ideation. We know that people who suffer, we know for certain that people who die by suicide tend to have the same genetic components as people who suffer from a variety of different kinds of impulse control. So struggle with impulse control. We know that genetically, the brains of people who suffer from various addictions have these handful of genes in common with people who actually die by suicide. We don't have as much genetic information as we would like to have, ideally would have, on people who struggle with suicidal ideation and people who are repeat attempters. Someone who's attempted more than 10 times, like I have, sounds extremely idiosyncratic when it's said out loud on a stage in a group, but actually it's much less unusual than you think. And I've met people under the age of 25 who have made more than 24 attempts. I remember one person I met right over here in research, just up the street, and her arms, just like she looked like they were tattooed from her attempts, and she was 19 or 20 years old, and we didn't talk about how many attempts she had made, but it was obvious, many. And she was a regular already at research. She was only, she wasn't even in her 20s yet. So yes, I think as far as the best minds on the subject right now go, we do expect that there will be. I argue that suicidal ideation is actually, and ultimately culminating in a suicide attempt or death by suicide in the unlucky cases. The vast majority of people who die by suicide are just unlucky while struggling with suicidal ideation. I argue that it is actually a form of addiction, and that the best way for understanding suicidal ideation is to apply to thinking about suicidal ideation the same sort of strategies and techniques that we use to work with other forms of addiction. I think it is a kind of habitual way, particularly pernicious habitual way of thinking that is probably genetically reinforced, just as most addictions are genetically reinforced, and but happily responds to a lot of techniques that we know work with addiction. And what is the #1 best-selling, most effective technique for addiction of virtually every kind? Just talking. It's free. It's easy once you learn how to do it, and it has like immediate salutary benefits. So I should probably quickly transition to since I should try. I have a lot more to say, but I should try to be practically helpful. There are. Am I out of time? 5 minutes. Okay.
15 minutes.
For Q&A, perfect. Okay. So let me, in this 5 minutes that remain to me, I'm sorry. I spent too much time on incidental things. Let me tell you in the 5 minutes remaining to me, 3 simple and proven techniques for people who suffer from suicidal ideation, and then 3 simple techniques that you can employ to help people who suffer. So the 3 techniques that we know work for people that you can share with someone if you know so. Everybody in this room knows someone who struggles with suicidal ideation. Whether you are aware of it or not, you do. And probably everyone in this room has been, in one way or another, pretty intimately touched by the problem of suicide. It's just pervasive. So these 3 techniques are 3 things that a person who's going in crisis needs to do. They need to lighten the pressure a little bit. They need to open the blinders a little bit, and they need to relieve the pain a little bit. Now, how do you do that? Well, opening the blinders, the best thing, and remembering this for yourself if you ever find yourself in this situation, or for a loved one, opening the blinders, the best technique is just letting this person remember that they've been in this situation before. They've been in despair before. They've been feeling like the only way out was dying before, and then time passed, and everything at the end of the day changed, became okay. Trying to remind yourself or remind a person of this, very helpful. There was a guy who famously jumped off the Golden Gate Bridge, and his name is Baldwin. And when he jumped off, he survived. He said that the thought that ran through his head was, I immediately realized, as soon as I leapt, that every single problem in my life that I thought was insolvable was totally solvable, except for the fact that I just jumped off the Golden Gate Bridge. We've all had similar sorts of experiences, whether or not we've ever reached a crisis point like that. Lightening the pressure. Lightening the pressure, I am an existentialist philosopher by training, and so I find myself very frequently writing and arguing against distraction. And in the age we live in, we are surrounded by distraction, and it's a problem. But when you're in crisis, distraction is your friend. And so anything that will distract this person, or distract yourself, could be just like a favorite song. We have these things that are called wellness reaction plans, where you make a plan. You're like, okay, here's my favorite movies, here's my favorite songs, etc., etc. I always tell people, look, if you decide not to kill yourself today, what have you got? A free day, right? You can always kill yourself tomorrow. Nobody's going to stop you. So, if you just postpone for one day, now you've got a free day. I mean, spend the whole day in bed watching Mission Impossible movies. Who's going to stop you? You are going to kill yourself. All right. Whatever it is that you want to do. For me, it was that McDonald's over on Broadway. I would go there to get a $1 ice cream cone. I'd be like, I'm not worrying about my weight today. I was going to kill myself today. And sometimes I'd go through the line 3 times. I remember one time a guy asked me, like, what, are you selling these on the corner? You were just here. I was like, yeah, I'd be in my car. And I was like, yeah, it's helping me. And then lessening the pain. And here's, I'm going to tell you something that, if someone ever calls you, this is the universal balm. I've used this on so many people, and I can tell you it has saved, it sounds ostentatious to say this, but it has saved dozens of lives. This simple thing. You get them to walk. And if you are feeling this way yourself, you get up and walk. Why does it work? First of all, we know walking, boom, immediately, endorphins, immediately the blood flows. But more important than that, 2 things are going to happen. You're getting them, or you're getting yourself out of the immediate environment that is providing the means, the possibility of killing yourself. If you're me, you're in your basement or you're in your garage looking at the rafters and thinking, last time I tried to kill myself was hanging myself with a dog leash. I came close. I'm very grateful and lucky to say I'm still here. But, now you're away from the rafters, right? You're out in the street. And then here's something that also sounds cheesy, but works. If you can tell this person or tell yourself to smile at somebody unexpectedly, someone who isn't expecting a smile. First of all, as we know, as my friend, the great thinker on depression, Andrew Solomon, teaches us, just smiling, boom, immediately you get endorphins. You're going to feel a little bit better just by forcing yourself to smile. But more importantly, you'll see in that other person's eyes that they weren't expecting this smile. And then be maybe a little confused, a little happy, a little grateful, and you will remember what the suicidal person must remember above all other things, which is that you are not bad. You are not evil. You are not deserving to die, because that's how you feel when you're in that mind space. But you are actually a source for good. You still have a task here in this life, which is as simple as just like bringing that little tiny smile to someone else. Boom, that person's day is improved. You've brought some good to the world that wasn't there a moment ago, just by this incredibly simple thing. Okay, those are the three things. And then I want to tell you, I won't go through the 5 things you should do but I will tell you 2 things that you really, I can't stop talking without telling you. You are in a privileged position, all of you. You've lived a long time, and you have not died. People say, of course, oh yeah, oh I see you had another birthday, and you say, well, better than the alternative. I wonder, is that always true? But is it always better than the alternative? We shouldn't be afraid of the question, right? We all are going to die. We're allowed to say it. We shouldn't be afraid to ask ourselves these tough things. In fact, shrouding them in that way is really part of the problem. But your privileged position means that people are looking to you and trusting you for how to live. And so if you can let people around you know that you are a safe person to talk to, that you're not going to immediately tell their parents or tell their spouse or call 988 or 911 and turn them in because if you can let people know you're a safe person to talk to, you can save more lives than any professional health. This was told to me. I have a friend who's one of the great bodhisattvas of the United States of America. His name is John. He founded the first suicide helpline he created. Though the reason we have suicide helplines right now is because of John. The 988 line, also architected by John. And when he talked to me, he has like this aura around it. It's really like light just comes from this guy. It's unusual. And he told me, you know what you have to tell everyone, Clancy? Just tell everyone they have a superpower. They're alive. If they're alive, they can save lives. How do they do it? Just by letting other people know that they can talk to them. Because if you're a health professional, a mental health professional, and someone says, I'm feeling like killing myself, you have these protocols you have to follow. And very likely they're going to have to wind up in a psychiatric hospital now. But for all of us, we don't have that responsibility. And those are the people who will save lives. And then the other thing, this is just crucial, and maybe we are prone to it a little bit because we're older, never offer them advice. Never try to fix their problems. Just keep them talking. Just be like, oh yeah, that sounds painful. Tell me more about that. Or what also is incredibly effective, if you can say, you know what, that reminds me of a time when X, Y, or Z happened to me. And tell them a story about your suffering, whatever it is, no matter how unpleasant or miserable it is, or how embarrassed it makes you. Be willing to share it with that person. And now you are throwing them a lifeline. I remember one time I was at research, but I was just visiting a student who had made an attempt on her life. A philosophy major, incredibly bright person. And I went and I looked at her and I was like, what can we talk about? She gave me this very disappointed look, like, I expected better from you than that. Like, just what can we talk about? She could see I was upset that she had. And I said, well, I'm not really sure what to say. And she said to me one of the most profound things that has ever been said to me since I've been doing this work. She said, You know what you could do? If you could just tell me one of your stories again about a time that you tried to kill yourself, that would be the most helpful thing to do right now. And so I did, you know, and she's alive and well, and now she manages 30 Starbucks down in Oklahoma. She's doing great. And anyway, okay, so now on to the Q&A, I guess. That's probably enough for it.
All right, I know you will have a lot of questions. We'll try to entertain as much as we can. So just raise your hand. Okay.
I was going to ask you if you, in your studies, does it say if religious people are less prone to suicide than those who don't believe in an afterlife?
Yeah, it's an important question. As it turns out, somewhat surprisingly and counterintuitively, religious people are not less prone to suicide by virtue of being religious. Now, people who have communities are significantly less prone to suicide than people who don't have communities. So the benefit of religion isn't necessarily a set of religious beliefs as we would think, you know. I mean, in my own set of beliefs, I think that it's a mistake to commit suicide for a whole host of reasons, some of which are what we might call supernatural kinds of reasons, you know, or we might call religious or spiritual reasons. I think that the categories don't work very well, but anyway, be that as it may. But it does turn out that if you, just like with getting older, and how your cognitive abilities, if you have friends, they last longer, you stay sharper, you live longer, et cetera, all these things, just by virtue of having friends, by doing what we're doing right now. Similarly with suicide, it has a very direct, so many religious people do have communities that non-religious people do not. And that's the benefit, as far as we can tell.
Okay, who was next? Bob?
Is there any group of,
Close to this.
oh, sorry, is there any other group of sentient beings that have suicidal ideation? I don't know how to actually define it, especially because the definition is based on us, on humans.
Yeah, it's a great question. You know, as many of you, when we think of suicide, many of us will think of that famous video about the lemmings going off of a cliff, which, you know, you may have heard. We subsequently learned was actually just a piece of filmmaking. They chased those poor lemmings off the cliff. Lemmings don't actually do that. They don't have these annual suicide events that was made up by the people who were making the film. However, it does look as though, as best we can tell, some other sentient beings other than us do commit suicide. The best people who work on this now think that bonobos and other advanced primates sometimes commit suicide. They think that dogs will commit suicide both for like the familiar heroic reasons that we think of, like, you know, there's the woman in the Humvee and suddenly an IED gets thrown into her Humvee and she recognizes that all of her friends are going to be killed unless she throws her body onto the explosive device. It looks like dogs and maybe some other non-human animals will knowingly sacrifice their own lives in a suicidal act, a heroic suicidal act. They also will starve themselves to death. Those stories about dogs starving themselves to death because of the death of a loved one, usually a human being, are true. But we have it particularly well documented among whales. Whales taking their own lives for reasons of despair. And it's not uncommon among a variety of different mammals in situations of incarceration, basically. You know, when they're kept in cages. You know, a variety, particularly of mammals, will take their own lives. Looks like so. No reason to distinguish it as far as we can tell from suicide.
Yes, Clancy. Do you think that the power of language and communication would be a good means to prevent any kind of suicidal act?
Yeah, I think it is, thank you, Louis. I think it is the single best medicine that we've got. It is the single best way we have of combating suicide, and particularly of dealing with individual people. I mean, I've just found this in my own work with people, which I imagine will continue until, and I also found it in my own life. You know, I usually end on a story that I didn't. I thought for, if you had told me 4 or 5 years ago, there is a solution to suicidal ideation, I would have been annoyed. I would have been very grumpy with you, because I was convinced, you know, this is just how I'm wired. I'm just always, every day, going to be thinking about suicide, and when things get particularly bad, I'm going to be thinking about it particularly a lot. And then about 3 or 4 years ago, it vanished. I mean, knock on wood, but I never think about suicide anymore. Never. And what changed? Nothing changed, except I started talking about suicide all the time, writing about suicide all the time, texting about suicide all the time, WhatsApping people. Boy, it sometimes gets a little heavy, I have to be honest with you. But anyway, it is, you know, I remember, I'm also a recovered alcoholic, and I remember when I would go to AA meetings on the plaza, and these old timers would be like, well, you know, you'd say, thanks, it was so helpful. And they'd be like, no, I don't do it to help you, I do it because it helps me. And I'd be like, yeah, it's just this old timer spouting the gospel, you know. It is just totally true. The best medicine for me has turned out to be, you know, helping other people and talking. So I think it's the whole thing. I think writing about it, talking about it, etc. I get frustrated sometimes, because I feel like it's like we could cure cancer by talking, and we're talking about something that's very often will rise as high as the number 6 cause of death worldwide. We could cure cancer by talking about it. We could cure COVID by talking about it. People will talk about it, you know. They won't talk about it when it happens in their own families. Frustrating. Young people will talk about it. When I used to teach this class, Money, Medicine, and Morals, with 400 students in it, and I'd have a day about suicide, and I'd say, okay, has anybody ever had the thought, you know, like, oh, I want to kill myself? And it's like, one hand goes up, 400 students, you know, over in Royal Hall, the 2 hands go up, and then suddenly, boom, like 300 hands go up. And you're like, okay, now I remember why I'm a professor. Now we have this opportunity to do some real talking. Please.
I just wanted to quickly just thank Dr. Hasan and the programs committee for inviting you, and really thank you for what you share, and actually what I've seen you share in other venues over the past few years. I'm sure you probably didn't really think that your life was going to change when you started talking about suicide ideation, and you have all these text messages on these people you communicate with, probably from all around the world now. But in my life, somewhat directly, I had one very close friend 2 years ago who I spent most of this holiday season talking through thoughts of suicide and things like that. And I had dinner and played pinball with him last night, so I'm thankful. But I think, you know, what you've talked about means those thoughts are probably still there. I just want to thank you. This is a difficult time of year for a lot of people, and so I think even though some people might say, you know what, why this topic today, I just commend our speaker and the programs committee for bringing it forward. Thank you.
Oh, well, thank you so much. That really means a lot to me. thank you all for coming and for your kind attention.
Well, thank you so much for your questions, and Martin, for your illuminating talk about this difficult subject. We really are grateful that you could make time to be with us and share some of the gems about these difficult issues. Thank you.
Thank you.